Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are joining us from. Before I begin and switch to French, I would like to give you some technical information to assure that everyone can understand us as well as possible. So the symposium will be conducted in a mix of French and English over the course of the week. For that reason, we are making simultaneous translation available. If you have the latest version of Zoom, you should see a globe labeled interpretation next to the leave button at the bottom right of your Zoom window. When you click on that, you should see the option for French or English interpretation, and you can also choose to mute the original audio. If you don't have the latest version of Zoom, it's very easy to check and update. Go to zoom.com and then check updates and follow through. It only takes a couple of minutes to update. There is also a closed captioning for English only. You should see a button labeled CC closed captioning at the bottom of your Zoom window next to the interpretation button. When you click it, you will have the option of having subtitles on screen or of opening the transcript of the conversation on the side of the image window. Please note that the live captioning is only available for English. Bonjour et bonjour à tous et à tous. Je repasse du coup au français. Donc nous sommes, je m'appelle Liliane Mobdiei, je suis coordinatrice de la recherche et avocat sans frontières et avec ma collègue Amaedo, nous sommes ravis de vous accueillir lors de cette troisième journée de la conférence Justice Now, faire face au passé colonial de l'Europe après le mouvement Black Lives Matter. Comme vous avez sans doute vu sur le programme, la journée d'aujourd'hui est assez conséquente. Nous allons commencer par le panel qui concerne les opportunités d'adresser le passé colonial sur le plan supranational. Et ensuite, nous passerons en deuxième partie à deux tables rondes. Une table ronde qui va examiner la gestion du passé colonial dans le contexte de la France, enfin, dans le contexte français, et puis une table ronde qui va examiner la gestion du passé colonial de la Grande-Bretagne. Avant d'entrer dans le vif du sujet de ce panel, je voudrais avant tout faire un petit récapitulatif pour donner un fil conducteur des journées, des deux premières journées, et aussi pour pouvoir faire la continuité par rapport aux autres panels, aux autres sessions qui vont suivre dans les prochains jours. Comme nous l'avons vu et dit jusqu'à présent, l'objectif de cette conférence est d'examiner dans quelle mesure le moment actuel offre des opportunités pour appuyer les combats contre les inégalités raciales et les combats relatifs à la gestion du passé colonial. L'examen de ces opportunités ou de ces potentielles opportunités se fait à plusieurs niveaux, tant sur le plan géographique. Nous avons pu le voir lors des deux premières journées. On a parlé du contexte des États-Unis, du contexte des Caraïbes, du contexte de plusieurs pays européens. Mais l'examen de cette opportunité se fait également en regardant en prenant plusieurs angles, comme on a vu aussi lors des journées précédentes. On a pu prendre l'angle de la question environnementale, l'angle de la question des relations internationales, de l'éducation, l'angle de l'espace public. Et donc, du coup, l'idée est de continuer dans cette perspective et de croiser les regards, de regarder comment la question de la gestion du passé colonial s'articule à plusieurs niveaux. Et c'est dans cette optique qu'on s'engage dans le panel qui va suivre, que ma collègue Amaedo et moi-même, nous allons modérer en anglais et en français, dans la mesure où on va chercher à comprendre quelles sont les opportunités qui s'offrent au niveau de plusieurs institutions qui ont une perspective supranationale. Je vais passer la parole à Amaedo pour qu'elle continue sur l'introduction du panel. Merci.
Thank you, Liliane. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. As Liliane mentioned, my name is Amaedo. I'm assistant professor of anthropology and African studies at MIT. My eye was distracted by a comment from in the audience saying crazy English translations. Yes, because the closed captioning only works for English. So everything that Liliane just said in French, the closed captioning cannot translate. So if you're seeing crazy transcripts, that's why, because it wasn't in English. So if you are, so just to reiterate what Liliane said at the beginning, we have simultaneous translation. So if you do not speak either language, you have the option of hearing in your headphones or on your computer the language that you do speak. And when you click on that interpreter button, you do have the option of muting the original audio. So you don't have to hear both who's speaking and the translation at the same time. And you have the closed captioning for the English. Hopefully that makes things a little bit more bearable for everyone. So as Liliane mentioned, we'll be moderating the Supranational Opportunities panel together, which I am so excited by, so very delighted for the wonderful guests we have who accepted our invitation. So in the past few months, as has been mentioned earlier, some states have adopted measures in the face of denunciations of structural racism and the link between structural racism and how the colonial past is reckoned with. And perhaps most notable among these state responses, at least at the European level, has been the establishment in Belgium of a special commission to examine the country's past with the Congo, Rwanda, and Burundi. And this will be discussed, this commission will be discussed in greater detail on the Belgium Roundtable, which is happening tomorrow. And so while such a measure as the commission and other measures in the US as like the HR 40 bill, which was established to study and develop reparations proposals for African Americans to examine the effects of slavery and recommend appropriate remedies, slavery and its aftermaths. So while some of these state measures might inspire tentative optimism, part of what emerged across the presentations in yesterday's panel on ongoing movements for reparations is the fact that interstate negotiations are actually highly complex and take a great deal of time to bear fruit, if any. Right. So for instance, we heard from Viren Shepherd, who spoke about the reparations brought from Jamaica in many instances since the 1950s to the UK and the sort of consistent obstacles that those demands have faced. We also heard from Magali Besson speaking on the French case about the limitations of the judiciary apparatus within the French national context because of the challenges of proving responsibility. And Besson suggested that the European Court for Human Rights might offer avenues that the French judicial system does not provide. Right. So what we saw across these presentations, and I won't get into the rest of them, is that what matters is what kind of reparations are being asked for and to whom these demands are being addressed. In other words, through what apparatus. All of which then raises the question of what opportunities different supranational entities, whether the EU, the UN, foundations, might offer to address the colonial past and its contemporary legacies. And that's what we're trying to get at in this panel. So we have four distinguished guests with us. Well, we have four distinguished guests lined up. We're having technical difficulties with one of them whom we're hoping will be able to join us still. So we're hoping to get her on the Zoom, but she is confirmed and said she was very much looking forward to joining our conversation. But for now, we have three of our guests. We have Birgit van Hout from the UN Commission for Human Rights. We have Aisha Osori from the Open Societies Initiative in West Africa. And we have Elisa Novik from Avocats Sans Frontières. And then the fourth guest, whom I think just arrived, is Pierrette Hertzberger Fofana, a member of the European Union Parliament. So together, all of these desks will speak about the efforts that are underway or possible in their respective institutions and what opportunities and challenge each of these offer. So Liliane and I will moderate together, with Liliane moderating in French and I in English. And each presentation will last approximately 10 minutes, after which we will open up for questions and discussion. Please send us your questions in the Q&A function. We found that the questions are so rich and we keep running out of time, but we are going to be documenting them and keeping them and hopefully find ways to address them later. Okay, so that's it with the introduction. And I will introduce Birgit van Hout, who will speak first. So Birgit van Hout is the regional representative for Europe at the OHCHR in Brussels since 2017. As a part of the Office of the Human Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, she works on promoting the Decade for People of African Descent, which is 2014 to 2025. And previously, she worked to advance human rights, the rule of law and democracy in Guatemala, Timor-Leste, Bosnia, Central Asia, Palestine, Venezuela, and Togo, which is where I'm from, with various departments of the United Nations, the European Union, and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Birgit holds an LLM, an MA in International Politics, and a postgraduate degree in International Human Rights Law. Thank you so much for joining us, Birgit, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Amma. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, perfect. Okay. I would like to thank the Department of Anthropology at MIT and Avocats Sans Frontières, dear Liliane, for inviting our office, the UN Human Rights Office, to address this interdisciplinary symposium. As you all know, the United Nations was erected on the ashes of a genocide fed by racial superiority doctrines. And therefore, the struggle against racism is part of the DNA of the United Nations, even though, and I say this with a lot of humility, our organization's record on inclusion is not perfect. Race and color are the first grounds of discrimination mentioned in Article 2 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And the International Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination was the first international human rights treaty that was adopted by the General Assembly in 1965. The Civil Rights Movement, the Independence Movement, the Anti-Apartheid Movement, and the Human Rights Movement all contributed to the global reckoning that peace, security, and development would only be possible if every person's rights, including the right not to be discriminated against, were protected and respected. And so, as we heard, measures have been taken to tackle racism and other forms of discrimination. In Europe, countries adopted anti-discrimination and hate crime legislation and established equality bodies. But the reality is that while progress was made, the measures proved largely insufficient to root out racism for several reasons, of which I would like to cite three. First of all, the legislation, policies, or programs adopted address individual acts of racism, but fail to acknowledge systemic forms of racism. And for many decades, structural and cultural racism have remained taboo. Second, while addressing some of the manifestations of racism, measures have failed to consider the root causes of racism and xenophobia, namely the enduring legacy of the past. And they fail to acknowledge the tremendous grievances which are the culmination of many generations of pain. Obviously, systemic racism and past injustices are closely linked. Thirdly, most measures were adopted without the participation of those affected by the scourge of racism. Efforts made often took a charitable or paternalistic approach, or an approach which characterized persons who were victims of racism not as right holders, but as recipients of services. And the result was that measures to counter racism have remained inadequate, social cohesion has remained elusive, and the promise of equality and dignity that is embodied by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has remained unfulfilled. The protests following the killing of George Floyd have put all three elements on the map: systemic inequities, the importance of dealing with the past, and the nothing about us without us imperative. In less than a year, We've seen the adoption of the EU's Anti-Racism Action Plan, the inaugural European Parliament commemoration of the European Day for the Abolition of the Slave Trade, and the first EU Anti-Racism Summit just last week, all of which specifically make reference to systemic racism, past injustices, and the need to include victims of racism in the development of public policies. The link between past and contemporary racism was clearly established at the 2001 World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa. In the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, states agreed that slavery and the slave trade are a crime against humanity and should always have been so. Slavery and the slave trade, including the transatlantic slave trade, were recognized as appalling tragedies in the history of humanity, especially in their negation of the essence of the victims. Article 13 of the Durban Declaration states that slavery and the slave trade are among the major sources of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance today. When it comes to colonialism, the Durban Conference recognized that Africans, people of African descent, people of Asian descent, and indigenous peoples were victims of colonialism and continue to be victims of its consequences. For the first time, states expressed regret that the effects and persistence of these structures and practices contributed to lasting social and economic inequalities in many parts of the world. 2021 is an important year as it marks the 20th anniversary of the adoption of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action. It also marks the midpoint of the International Decade of People of African Descent, of which our High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, is the coordinator. The program of activities of the decade focuses on recognition, justice, and development. These are the three themes. Recognition includes promoting the culture, history, and heritage of people of African descent through education and research, as well as the inclusion of these elements in school curricula. At the Human Rights Council's urgent debate last June on racial violence, systemic racism, and discriminatory policing, our High Commissioner Bachelet recognized our collective failure to acknowledge and confront the legacy of the slave trade and colonialism. As the UN Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Racism has also underscored, many contemporary manifestations of racial discrimination must be understood as a continuation of insufficiently remediated historical forms and structures of racial injustice and inequality. The UN Special Rapporteur, the UN Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent, of which distinguished Vereen Shepherd used to be an expert, and the other Durban follow-up mechanisms have all called for reparatory justice. In practical terms, this will require making amends for centuries of violence and discrimination, including through formal apologies, truth-telling processes, and reparations in various forms. Comprehensive and inclusive consultation with those affected should lead to justice, accountability, and reconciliation. And I'd like to say that an acknowledgement of responsibility is a prerequisite, of responsibility for wrongdoing is a prerequisite for any meaningful transitional justice process. In a report to the UN Human Rights Council, the UN Special Rapporteur on Cultural Rights has also referred to the importance of memorialization processes. All of this should stimulate civic engagement, critical thinking, and discussions about the representation of the past, while also highlighting its contemporary consequences, like persisting racial stereotypes, discrimination, exclusion, and violence. Dear participants, it is clear that the breadth and depth of measures to address the causes, manifestations, and consequences of racism have been insufficient. According to a recent report by the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights, FRA, only around half of EU member states currently have national action plans against racism in place. a measure that was also recommended in the Durban Programme of Action as a tool to tackle racism in a holistic manner. With the creation by the European Union of a subgroup of states to implement the EU Anti-Racism Action Plan at the national level, a new momentum, however, has arisen for the development of national action plans against racial discrimination. A rights-based approach to this endeavor requires that such plans and the process for developing them are premised on the principles of inclusion, participation, transparency, and accountability. The Durban Declaration and Programme of Action emphasizes the importance of the participation of the victims in the development, implementation, and evaluation of the plan, and makes specific reference to persons of African descent, persons of Asian descent, Jewish, Muslim, and Arab communities, Roma, Sinti, travelers, indigenous peoples, minorities, refugees, and migrants. Developing a national action plan against racism also requires a whole of society approach to ensure broad ownership and buy-in. State institutions should be in the lead, but they should involve all sectors of society, private sector, equality bodies, the media, social partners, etc. A national action plan against racism should be broad in scope and comprehensive. This means that it should also deal with the past. Recognizing the past is the first step to repairing the present, and it is key to building the future. While no country is free from racism, every country is also different. Therefore, a meaningful start of the work on national action plans against racism would be for each country to develop a diagnostic of the manifestations, causes, and consequences of racism and xenophobia through broad consultations. Our office, by the way, has issued a practical guide to assist states as well as right holders to develop an effective national action plan against racism. We've provided substantive and technical support to countries in the development of such plans, and we stand ready to continue to do so. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Birgit van Hout, and thank you for sharing with us this important perspective that it's been 20 years since the declaration of Durban, but we still have a long way to go, unfortunately. Je vais maintenant présenter et donner la parole à Pierrette Hetzberg, Fofana Hetzberg. Donc, Dr Pierrette Fofana Hetzberger est députée européenne et la première femme d'origine africaine à être élue au Parlement européen en provenance d'Allemagne. Elle est la première vice-présidente de la Commission du développement et membre suppléante de la Commission des droits des femmes et de l'égalité des genres. Fervente défenseuse de l'égalité et des droits humains, Madame Hetzberger Fofana était conseillère municipale dans sa ville natale d'Erlangen. Au cours de son mandat, elle a mis en place les semaines de l'histoire des Noirs dans le cadre de la décennie des Nations Unies pour des personnes d'ascendance africaine, afin de promouvoir la justice, la reconnaissance et le développement. Madame Fofana, la parole est à vous.
Merci. Mais malheureusement, le texte, il est en anglais. Oui? Allô, vous m'entendez?
Oui, pas de problème. Allez-y. En anglais, c'est très bien. C'est comme vous voulez. En français, en anglais, on est prêt pour vous.
C'est pas grave. On l'a préparé en anglais. Je l'aurais fait de préférence parce que je peux plus dire. C'est tout. Alors, I would like to thank you for organizing this event and for inviting me. It's such a pleasure to take part in this discussion with other researchers, experts, and committed advocates for racial justice. Above all, I enjoy a work that reflects solidarity, diversity of opinions, and a focus on the ways forward. I have been committed to addressing racism for decades, including the recognition and impact of historical racism. When I was working, as you said before, as a city councillor, 2009-2019, I have introduced in 2009 in Germany, the Anti-Racism Week in my city, Erlangen. Now, every year, from 21 March, the Anti-Racist Week take place. In 2013, I also started the project School Without Racism, School with Respect. At that time, I was teaching French at the university and at the college. And the aim of my initiative was to teach my pupils and my students how to fight racism and to develop the spirit of tolerance. Until today, as you can see it, Black History Weeks. So it was 2015. I introduced this one, Black History Weeks. I don't know if you see that. And but at that time, nobody was speaking was from Black Lives Matter. And as you can see it, Black Lives Matter, yes? So why I make the Black History Weeks in Germany? The first time, 2015, I invited the 3 survivors of the Holocaust. I suppose most of the people didn't know that in the concentration camps, there have been also Black people, and there were 3, and all. I am very happy that I had at that time the 3 survivors, because now 2 of them dead. One, who was Gertschan, was in Buchenwald. Buchenwald was the biggest concentration camp, and he was put there, and he was 14. If you are 14, of course, you are not a political person, yeah? 14 until 16. The other one were on the, what they said, not concentration camp, but work camp. Theodor Michael, who passed away last year. And I must say, as I have been in Washington for 2 years, I had the pleasure to meet Jesse Jackson, and Jesse Jackson write for Theodor Michael a message, and he was very moved. And the third one is the lady that the only one who is leading now, Marie Neja, was put in, you know, the Nazis were very, they had a lot of imagination, fancy, yes? Yes, and they put all the Black people who were at that time, they were children from white mother and Black men. They brought them in Berlin, and they wanted that, they make film, you know, the Nazi propaganda and racist film with those children. It's really pity, but it has been the way how they saved their life too. And the Marie Neja was in that, I don't know how we can say it, it's not a jail, it was just a center, in that center. In the collective consciousness, Germany was not a colonial power. However, Germany occupied several countries in Africa. Following the Berlin Conference, Germany officially occupied Southwest Africa, called German South Africa, from 1884 to 1992, also before the First World and to the Second World War, which became then the German Southwest became independent. Namibia is Namibia in 1990. Many people are not aware of the fact that the first genocide of the 20th century took place in this protectorate of Southwest Germany, now Namibia. 65,000 Namibians out of the population of 80,000 were brutally massacred for refusing to give up their land. They were the Hereros and the Naba. Today, Namibians are demanding the return of the skulls kept in Germany. In 2018, Germany returned 27 skulls to Namibia. We just hope that one day Germany is going to apologize for this massacre and to give back all the skulls and everything where they steal, yes, in Namibia. What is happening in the world now is the result of an oppressive colonialist structure. That is the reason what I think that we cannot talk about today's manifestation of racism without being brave and unpacking past violence. That is why we must understand the historical dimension. Now, I would like to tell you about some of the relevant developments at the EU level. In March 2019, the Parliament adopted the resolution on the fundamental rights of people of African descent. This resolution was the first resolution to encourage EU institutions and the member states to officially acknowledge and mark the histories of people of African descent in Europe, including of past and ongoing injustice and crime against humanity, such as slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, or those committed under European colonialism. It is also recommended to the member states to recognize achievement and positive contributions of people of African descent through both the official recognition at EU and national level of the International Day of Remembrance of the Victims of Slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, and through establishing everywhere in all Europe Black History Month. Article 12 of the European Parliament resolution on the anti-racism protest following the death of George Floyd, which we adopted in June last year, called for the EU institution and the member states to officially acknowledge past injustice and crime against humanity committed against Black people, non-white people, and Roma and Sinti and Roma. It is also declares slavery a crime against humanity and calls for 2 December to be designated the European Day commemorating the abolition of the slave trade. I must say maybe here that 2014, I made in my city in Erlangen an exhibition about the, in French it is les héros et héroïnes occultés de la héros et héroïnes occultés de la traite transatlantique. The heroes, the unknown heroes of the transatlantic slave, so like that. And I must say I was really surprised to know that in which member state, European member state, there has been slave, but they don't say slave, they say Mohrenkinder, also Page, Edelpage, they said Edelpage, they give, you know, a name as a euphemism. And for example, I can give you maybe one example from Germany, or one maybe, you know, Sissi. Sissi is was the Imperatrice of, I would say Imperatrice, Queen, the big Queen of Austria. And she got, she took at that time, it was in the 19th century, a Black man who was 1.30 meter, and he got encephalitis. Encephalitis, you know, you have water in the head, and of course it was not so beautiful because his disability. And she took that child to be a play for her own children, and also to afraid the ladies in the cart, you know. So, and in Germany it was the same. If you look at on the pictures in Germany from the 18th and 19th century, you always see is always a small child. And we know now that most of those children have been abused, sexual abuse. That's the new research. So, and that's why the European Union encouraged the member states to make the history of Black people and people of color and Roma part of their school curricula. In the first ever EU-wide anti-racism policy adopted last September by the European Commission, the EU Anti-Racism Action Plan 2020-2025, one can read that prejudice and stereotype can in the first place be addressed by acknowledging the historical roots of racism. Colonialism and slavery and the Holocaust are embedded in our history and have profound consequences for society today. Ensuring remembrances is an important part of encouraging inclusion and understanding. The EU should, for example, explicit marquee commemorative day linked to racism as proposed by the European Parliament and the Commission concluded. On December 2nd, Anti-Racism and Diversity Intergroup, ARDI, together with European Network of People of African Descent and the UN, organized 2 high-level panels on the histories and legacies of the transatlantic trade and enslavement of Africans and people of African descent in Europe and the Caribbean. My colleague and I are still under the strong impression after great discussions. We thank you one more time for the great cooperation. I am proud to join other committees MEPs in the declaration by the European Parliament to condemn slavery as a crime against humanity and officially acknowledge past injustice and crimes. However, this was a symbolic art which must be concretized by the best appropriation of history to effectively address racism. As the Vice President of the Development Commission, I am involved in the EU-Africa strategy. In this EU-Africa strategy, we demand that school books reflect true history, when that would reflect more than a one-sided selective interpretation. We have as well demanded proper and comprehensive picture of the past. Now, we must build a mechanism to review existing proposal and to monitor the implementation of this proposal and better understand the situation at the level of member states in this regard. I would also like to emphasize that responsibility to mark March 21, December 2, and other important dates lies on institutions, not on civil society and intergroups. Institutions at all levels must start doing this. Nevertheless, not for the sake of showing that they care, but for the sake of raising awareness, education, and to create more spaces for finding good solutions. They are also responsible to apply our recommendations in practice and build a better future for all of us. I will keep fighting in and outside the Parliament for racial justice. The issue we talked about need to be addressed in politics, but also in everyday life. I raised my voice, and I am always going to raise my voice for justice. I truly hope that what I shared was useful for my fellow panelists, participants, and the audience. Thank you for listening, and I am happy to discuss in the Q&A session. However, since we usually do not have a lot of time, please feel free to continue this conversation with me after the event. If you have any additional questions, concern, or recommendation for us, you can write to the coordinator of Anti-Racism and Diversity Group, ARDI, and Elena will come back to you. I am sure you and Elena will be happy to share the contacts. But my one message is recognizing the past is the first step to build together the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Herzberger-Fofana. Thank you for that presentation and for the work that you do and the work that all our panelists are doing. And thank you for casting a light on the absences and the silences in the kind of on the German colonial past and also on Germany's Holocaust past, right? And the presence of Black people in the Holocaust, as well as the very real reality of genocide in Namibia and of Germany's colonial past and involvement in Africa. So thank you for that. And I think we will have lots of questions about how one goes about pushing reforms within the EU kind of mechanically. How does this work institutionally? And we can hopefully come back to that during the Q&A. But I will first introduce our next speaker, Aisha Osori. One of the fronts, as Ilian mentioned, and as came up in several of the presentations yesterday, one of the main fronts on which this debate for how to address Europe's colonial past in Africa, one of the fronts where that's being held is around the restitution of artifacts and around the museum world and the world of arts and culture more broadly. And foundations play a significant role on that scene, as we all know. So Aisha Osori is Executive Director of OSIWA, the Open Society Initiative for West Africa. And she will be speaking, giving us a sense of what's happening on that scene. She is a lawyer, a development consultant, and communication strategist with 18 years of experience in the public and private sectors. She has worked with the World Bank, UNICEF, and the National Democratic Institute on a wide range of projects focusing on women's economic and political empowerment, gender equality, and governance. Aisha is an advocate for women's rights in Nigeria, and is a non-executive director on the board of the Nigerian Women Trust Fund. She graduated from the University of Lagos and Harvard Law School and holds a master in public administration from Harvard Kennedy School. Aisha, welcome, and we are all ears.
Thank you very much, Amma. Can you all hear me? Good? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Just wanted to make sure. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm already learning so much. Thank you to the organizers for the opportunity to engage on this important and multidimensional topic alongside this panel of very knowledgeable people. I've already enjoyed listening to Bridget and Pierrette. I'd like to speak today first on the wider theme of tackling legacies of Europe's colonial past in the wake of Black Lives Matters, before narrowing my observations and recommendations down to the role of supranationals, including international philanthropies such as the Open Society Foundations, which is the umbrella foundation under which OSIWA falls. And if just for clarity, OSF covers work in 120 countries around the world. Now, I see two major opportunities to address the legacy of Europe's colonialism. And the obvious one is the first one, the one that Amma mentioned, the one that's gaining traction, which is the subject of restitution of Africa's cultural heritage. This comes on the back, obviously, of decades of demands from African states, communities, and families for the return of stolen material, cultural heritage, and property. And more recently, the wave around restitution is based on the comments of President Macron in 2017 when he was speaking to students in Ouagadougou, and then that triggered the Savoy report in 2018, and the more recent law passed in France towards the end of 2020, restituting 26 objects of art to Benin Republic and 1 object to Senegal. And this obviously is tied to conversations that are still ongoing, e.g. in the news recently, to reparations in Evanston, Illinois. The other less globally discussed way of tackling the legacy of Europe's colonial past is police brutality and the inherited ethos of policing Blacks all around the world. The outdated laws still applicable in many African countries today that criminalize the poor, that harken back to a time when colonialists didn't want Blacks in their government reserved areas. And so vagrancy and other petty offenses became crimes to discourage movement. Yet these same GRAs are still in existence today, still policed to discourage citizens from moving around the neighborhoods where the rulers live and play. And those who follow the EndSARS protests in Nigeria at the end of 2020 will understand what I'm talking about. Now, as Victor Ahikamano said it best, he's an artist from Nigeria as well. He said this weekend, in reaction to the news of the Humboldt Forum's plans, Humboldt Forum is based in Germany, its plans to return Benin bronzes looted from the Benin Kingdom in 1897. He said, and I quote, "Colonial history told by British historians is a glorification of inhuman conquest." The only thing I would add to that quote is violent inhuman conquest, because that's what it took to take people's property from them, to rob them of their culture, while creating narratives to justify it as part of the legacy of keeping the people down, while still exploiting them materially, culturally, emotionally, and spiritually. This is the violent, oppressive police culture that exists across Africa and other parts of the world today, where colonialism and/or slavery is part of the history. And it's that same intentionality that went into the justification theories for colonialism and slavery. That's the same intentionality that's required now as we seek restitution, not just for past injustices and derailments of our collective development, but to chart a new future which rebalances the scales and allows us to reimagine existing relationships. This includes new ways of policing for protection and productivity, and not policing for oppression and extraction. In both these areas, restitution and police brutality, there is immense opportunity for supernatural entities to engage, both on the institutional multilateral agency level, but also with philanthropies such as ours, who have vast amounts of resources that combined sometimes exceed what some states have, and we can deploy them towards addressing these two issues. But for today, I'm focusing my comments really on restitution, but really couldn't miss the opportunity to show the link, the interconnectedness between the violent policing that we're experiencing today and colonialism and racism. So focusing on restitution, let me say that restitution is a perfect subject of a supernatural effort because it takes collaboration across borders at local, national, regional, and international levels. For instance, the ECOWAS 5-year regional plan has required work across 15 countries that are in various different levels of understanding and appreciation of the need for restitution. And of course, the 27 objects that France passed the law to restitute to Benin and Senegal took years of communities, families, in the case of El Hajj Omar Tal's sword, legislators, governments, civil society, diplomats and academics all worked around this issue to get us to where we are. So now what's possible in terms of what the OSF restitution, what OSF has been doing around restitution? I'd like to start with a little brief background of what happened in November 2019 when we OSF launched a $15 million 4-year initiative to support a range of efforts towards the restitution and reappropriation of objects of cultural, artistic, spiritual, political, and historical significance that were looted from Africa. The aim of this initiative is to increase the momentum for restitution by supporting the existing efforts of citizens, artists, educators, indigenous communities, and civil society organizations working to return Africa's looted cultural property to its rightful home. We see the imperative for restitution going beyond the ownership of objects to giving future generations of people on and from the African continent ownership of their history, their culture, and identity. So what have we been doing since then? 3 things with support for artists, support for institutions, and support for academics and civil society. Around support for artists, we support artists just for art's sake, not without any particular agenda. So for example, in Senegal, we've supported the rebuilding and design of very popular artist communes. We've given grants to artists working in Senegal, Ghana, Cameroon, Kenya, South Africa, to support the development of artistic space, as well as support the professional development of creatives and curators working on restitution, such as the African Artists Foundation that's based in Lagos. We've also supported talking about restitution outside the elite audiences, and we've done that through the Soros Arts Fellowship, which is the fellowship we run through Open Society Foundations. And this has been engaging different artists to use their work to open up discussions in areas where people don't normally discuss restitution. One example is Faustine Leniekula, a choreographer in Kisangani in the Democratic Republic of Congo, whose practice engages history and diaspora broadly and the production of African knowledge. We also support institutions, as I said. The key institutions so far that we've worked with is ECOWAS, based in West Africa. We are very proud that ECOWAS is the very first regional body to design a restitution action plan. And we in OSIWA are working closely with them for the effective implementation of these plans. Part of this supports convenings, mobilizing key West African stakeholders such as academia, in the diaspora and at home, museum directors, artists, to demand restitution. We supported a meeting of directors of cultural heritage of the 15 ECOWAS countries just last week. We put them together to assess the legal framework around restitution, looking at the UNESCO conventions on international cooperation and assistance, UNODROIT laws. And these efforts have led to greater collaboration and coordination between ECOWAS and directors of cultural heritage and has enhanced the mobilization of key stakeholders in the region to advocate for restitution and chart out a clear roadmap for actors engaged in advocacy. We're also in preliminary discussions with AU, very excited by the theme of the year for 2021, which is arts, culture, and heritage, levers for building the Africa we want. We see this as a good platform to see how AU can champion in all the different forums that it engages with Europe and the EU and America and China to see how best we can they can champion the cause for restitution in a structured way. And again, we've been involved in support for academics and civil society. In fact, two of the academics, civil society that I want to use an example today are part of the Justice Now Symposium panelists. Yesterday, I understand Siraj Rasool, a professor of history at the University of Western Cape, based in Cape Town. He's one of our partners. He's involved in mentoring a new generation of African museum professionals who challenge the notion of Eurocentric museum practices. Another civil society that we support, for example, is BAMCO, that's based in Belgium. I understand the president, Mireille Sehoussi Robert, will be on the panel, the Belgium panel roundtable that I think Amma mentioned earlier. So BAMCO is an Afro-feminist organization based in Brussels, whose members are strategically involved in eradicating anti-Black racism in Belgium. And there are many other academic civil society that we're supporting, both in the diaspora and at home. Now, just to close, I will just touch briefly on the opportunities for the future, which not just for us in terms of the work that we do across OSF, but also for other multilaterals interested in this topic. I think the first one is advocacy and diplomacy. We need more from the AU, the ECOWAS, and the other African regional economic communities to champion the cause for restitution and build on the current momentum following France's return and conversations around Germany returning some of the looted Benin bronzes back to Nigeria. We want to see how they can take every opportunity for engagement, whether it's the AU-EU summit, CHOGM, Commonwealth Heads of Government meetings, the EU Strategy for Africa meeting, the EU Anti-Racism Action Plan, UNGA, just every opportunity they should use to chart a way towards addressing the systemic injustice that we talked about earlier, but what Bridget mentioned. The second thing that's an opportunity for all players is restitution claims. And it's also, as I'm saying this, these are areas that we are also looking at working on in the future. Restitution claims, these are really technical aspects and really unglamorous work of putting together the claims to countries that require research, require proving the provenance of items, and we need more philanthropic support for this. We also need international cooperation and assistance to push through the legislative measures and regulations to make restitution happen. Third, we need to prepare for the return. Some of the excuses, arguments that we've heard is that there's nowhere to put these items, despite the fact that we've looked after them for hundreds of years before they were taken. But supernaturals can help in financing the ecosystem to ensure steady and sustainable return of heritage back to the continent. Senegal invested $30 million building a museum of Black civilization dedicated to reshaping the narratives of Africa's history and cultures. The AU has initiated a great museum of Africa that's supposed to be located in Algeria, which seeks to showcase the rich heritage of the African continent. I also know that in preparation for receiving the Benin bronzes that they've been advocating for years, Edo State government in Nigeria is also working on raising financing to build a suitable museum. So more of this type of support is necessary. The fourth thing we can be doing is envisioning the future, this is where we support thinkers, academics, civil society, artists, more convenings such as what Justice Now is doing to help us think through what needs to be done to take maximum advantage of what's going on. When these items go, where will they go? We also need to start rethinking the traditional models of museums, considering that the history of museums has not been, what's the word I'm looking for, has not been all positive. They became devices to help shape the remembrance of colonial violence and colonial cultural destruction as it circulated, as our art and property circulated private homes and public collections. And museums help to keep creating that difference between the global North and the global South, always projecting one as civilized and one as barbaric. And so we need those spaces for artists and creative industries to play a role in recreating, reappropriating these departed projects and resocializing these objects back into our arts and cultural spaces, and just international forums, festivals, school curricula. And then finally, which again, not tied to restitution, but as I said, I can't resist the opportunity. We really need more global collaboration on humane policing. Talking about police brutality is not enough, and thinking about it in isolation as country-specific problems is not enough. The police brutality that many Black people, young people face all around the world is tied to racist ideology and the oppression and exploitation of people. We need the UN, the UNHCR, the AU, global think tanks to take a worldwide view of police brutality and how to end it. The AU, for instance, could do with a much stronger and enforceable protocol or regulation on police brutality. For this is linked to democracy, accountability, human rights, and many other things that they say they care about. What we have now from the AU is a soft, non-binding guideline developed by the African Commission on Human and People's Rights on the role of police in arrest and detention of individuals, and it's not enough. But these are just some of the things that I think that we should be thinking about creatively, and I'm sure there are a lot more that we'll hear from other panelists. I'll stop there and happy to take any questions, address any comments going forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aisha Ozori, for giving the Osiwa perspective, and thank you for showing us how the restitution of cultural objects is a field where a lot of things are happening. There are a lot of opportunities, and also there is a transnational collaboration that is happening at different levels, whether it's very local, but also at a international organizations level. I think it's quite exciting to see all these initiatives that are happening in different countries, and I'm sure that we have a lot of questions to dig deep in that. On va passer maintenant à notre dernière intervenante. Si je retrouve. Donc Elisa Novick, qui est ma collègue. Donc Elisa Novick travaille actuellement comme experte en justice transitionnelle chez Avocats sans frontières, où elle appuie plus particulièrement les projets de justice transitionnelle en Tunisie, en République démocratique du Congo, en République centrafricaine et en Ouganda. Elle a occupé diverses fonctions avant d'arriver chez Avocats sans frontières, et en particulier au sein de la Fondation Max Planck pour la paix internationale et l'état de droit à Heidelberg. Elle est titulaire d'un doctorat en droit international de l'Institut universitaire européen, et sa thèse porte sur le concept de génocide culturel en droit international. Elle a été publiée en 2016 aux presses universitaires d'Oxford. Je préviens que j'ai demandé à Elisa de parler en français pour les besoins de rendre un peu le panel un peu plus bilingue. Merci Elisa d'avoir accepté.
Merci Liliane, c'était compliqué. Merci beaucoup pour l'introduction et bonjour à toutes et tous. J'espère que vous allez bien m'entendre et me suivre, notamment avec la connexion Internet, on va voir. Donc mon propos aujourd'hui, c'est un peu de revenir un peu aussi à l'origine de cette conférence, qui est l'établissement de cette commission parlementaire en Belgique. Ce n'est pas complètement l'origine de la conférence, mais c'est un des gros points de départ. L'établissement de cette commission parlementaire en Belgique pour aborder le passé colonial de la Belgique et ses conséquences actuelles. Et en fait, je voudrais un peu partager avec vous toutes les réflexions que cela a un peu occasionné chez ASF, et notamment d'un point de vue de la justice transitionnelle. En fait, en juin 2020, l'année dernière, quand il y a eu une annonce d'établissement d'une telle commission, au départ, la commission était présentée comme une commission vérité et réconciliation. Et donc, tout de suite, on est rentré véritablement dans le domaine de la justice transitionnelle. Je réexpliquerai dans un instant ce que c'est, mais on a déjà eu hier une présentation aussi sur la justice transitionnelle. Mais donc, très rapidement, c'est vrai que la boîte à outils justice transitionnelle a émergé. Et puis, on a eu un rétropédalage de la commission qui, dans son mandat, dit « Ah, attention, on n'est pas véritablement une commission justice vérité, mais un peu quand même ». Et c'est quand même donné un mandat de justice transitionnelle, puisque le mandat porte sur la mémoire et sur la réconciliation avec de forts éléments de justice transitionnelle. Et donc, on est face à cet objet un peu non identifié du point de vue du droit, du point de vue de la justice transitionnelle, mais qui a une ambition assez large et qui peut potentiellement constituer un modèle pour d'autres pays, mais avec aussi beaucoup de défis et d'écueils potentiels auxquels il faut réfléchir. Donc c'est vraiment un point de départ de la réflexion auquel je vais me référer sans doute assez régulièrement et qui va être abordé dans plein de détails demain durant la table ronde sur la Belgique. Mais en tout cas, c'est vraiment le point de départ et voir un petit peu quels sont les défis et les opportunités. Donc peut-être pour revenir à une définition de la justice transitionnelle, pour voir aussi comment on se positionne par rapport aux domaines qui existent. Donc la justice transitionnelle, c'est un domaine d'études et un domaine aussi de pratique qui s'est développé en fait par la pratique. Ce n'est pas vraiment un domaine qui est très théorisé. C'est tout un ensemble de mécanismes de justice qui sont mobilisés dans le cadre en général d'une transition, soit d'un conflit armé vers une situation de paix relative, soit à la suite de la chute d'un régime autoritaire. Et donc, ce sont des mécanismes de justice pour aborder tout un passé de répression et de violation de droits humains qui ont été parfois souvent très graves. Le domaine s'est progressivement consolidé autour de 4 grands piliers que Pablo de Greff nous a présentés hier, mais que je voudrais quand même répéter aujourd'hui. D'abord, les poursuites pénale, c'est celui auquel on pense le plus quand on pense à la justice, ça va d'abord être la responsabilité pénale, mais également le concept de vérité qui est vraiment très présent et qui souvent va être institutionnalisé via une commission vérité-réconciliation, donc qui peut prendre différentes formes. Le troisième pilier, c'est la question des réparations pour les victimes. La réparation étant un concept très large en droit international qui dépasse la réparation financière et individuelle, et ça c'est très pertinent pour le débat sur la question du passé colonial. Et puis tout ce qui est garantie de non-répétition, qui sont des réformes plus structurelles. En fait, si on prend les origines de la justice transitionnelle, on voit très peu de relations avec le fait colonial. Dans les premiers écrits, les premiers grands ouvrages de référence, on ne trouvera pratiquement aucune mention de la colonisation. Puis en fait, c'est un domaine qui s'est élargi de plus en plus. Pour certains, il s'est beaucoup trop élargi, pour d'autres, c'est une opportunité. Mais il s'est aussi élargi justement du fait de ces questionnements autour de l'impact de ces passés coloniaux sur les présents et notamment sur des sociétés qui étaient dans des processus de justice transitionnelle. On a par exemple, donc, l'idée aussi qui est vraiment liée à la justice transitionnelle, c'est un peu l'idée du plus jamais ça, on a dit never again ou camas en espagnol, ce sont des termes qui reviennent vraiment régulièrement. Et il est arrivé à un point où c'était compliqué de se limiter à des mandats très fermés de justice transitionnelle, c'est-à-dire si on est dans le cadre d'une justice transitionnelle par rapport à une situation de conflit armé, de se limiter aux seules dates du conflit armé, parce que souvent les causes du conflit armé vont être des causes très profondes. Et quand on veut s'attaquer aux causes profondes, souvent on va revenir au passé colonial et aux situations d'inégalité et d'injustice qui ont pu être créées déjà dans le cadre de la colonisation. Et donc ça a été une première instrumentalisation de la justice transitionnelle pour aborder le passé coloniaux au-delà des mandats même des institutions de justice transitionnelle, et ça permet de contextualiser aussi un peu. Donc ça, on l'a vu beaucoup au Rwanda, où le TP regarder vraiment la responsabilité de la Belgique, sans forcément l'appeler responsabilité, mais dans la création d'identité, mais aussi au Kenya sur tout ce qui était question foncière. Donc ça, c'est une première utilisation qui est devenue intéressante, mais qui a finalement peu de conséquences au-delà de la contextualisation. Plus récemment, on a eu le cas de la Tunisie, qui est dans un processus de justice transitionnelle suite à la révolution de 2011 et la chute du régime de Ben Ali. Donc c'est un processus qui vraiment accompagne la démocratisation du pays et qui vraiment tourne autour d'une instance qui est l'instance vérité-dignité, qui est une commission de réconciliation, de justice et réconciliation. On va avoir, je pense, dans un instant la présidente de cette instance qui va aussi pouvoir parler. Mais ce qui est très intéressant, c'est que dans le cadre d'un mandat qui était finalement assez large au niveau temporel, mais qui remontait à la date de l'indépendance de la Tunisie, on a une instance, une institution indépendante qui a fait une demande de réparation à la France. En tant qu'ancienne puissance coloniale, mais pour des faits qui avaient été commis à la suite de l'autonomie puis l'indépendance de la Tunisie. Ça, c'est quelque chose qui est aussi extrêmement pertinent. Donc, la manière dont les pays qui connaissent des transitions ont pu s'approprier ces mécanismes de justice transitionnelle et les retourner aussi à l'attention des anciennes puissances coloniales. C'est un peu le problème et le risque avec la justice transitionnelle, c'est qu'on en fasse un outil qui est limité aux sociétés dites du Sud global, avec beaucoup de guillemets, et finalement qui devient un outil plus de coopération internationale avec des processus qui vont souvent être d'ailleurs financés par les États du Nord via de l'aide au développement. Mais on voit aussi de plus en plus des sociétés au Nord qui s'engagent dans ce type de processus, et ce sont des sociétés qui elles-mêmes reposent sur des fondations coloniales. Donc un des gros exemples, c'est celui du Canada, qui a engagé un processus de vérité et réconciliation pour toutes les souffrances qu'ont connues les peuples autochtones au Canada, et en particulier les enfants qui étaient transférés dans des pensionnats au cours du 19e et 20e siècle. Mais ce qui est très intéressant, c'est que c'est une société vraiment qui est, on en a parlé dans la toute première présentation, qui est vraiment dans une logique d'élimination, qui s'est construite dans une logique d'élimination des Premières Nations. Et là, on a eu un processus qui est très large et qui est parti en fait du présent, qui est parti des souffrances actuelles pour revenir sur tout l'historique et aussi prendre des mesures sur le futur. Donc, il y a une vraie dimension intergénérationnelle qui est extrêmement intéressante aussi comme processus de référence. Donc, en fait, on voit qu'au fur et à mesure que la justice transitionnelle s'applique, son champ évolue de manière assez large. Ce n'est plus seulement un outil pour les sociétés du Sud, ça peut être aussi au niveau des sociétés du Nord. C'est très pertinent dans des sociétés qui se sont construites sur une logique coloniale et qui peut vraiment aborder le présent de manière vraiment très différente. Donc, il y a beaucoup d'opportunités qui peuvent se présenter pour les sociétés qui souhaiteraient l'aborder. Maintenant, il y a aussi énormément de défis. Donc déjà, la justice transitionnelle, c'est un domaine qui est beaucoup critiqué à plein de niveaux. On pourrait en parler pendant des heures. Mais ce qui est très intéressant, je pense, pour nous, c'est de nous intéresser un peu à tout ce qui sont les leçons apprises et les critiques qui peuvent être formulées, et justement essayer de faire attention dans l'utilisation de mécanismes dans d'autres contextes. Et donc, je vais un peu partir du cas de nouveau de la Belgique, qui est un cas d'étude assez intéressant, donc, où on a une commission qui est parlementaire, une commission qui est politique et qui est au niveau de l'État, et qui veut s'intéresser au passé, au présent et d'une certaine manière au futur, tant en interne que dans des relations avec des États tiers. Les États tiers actuellement, que sont la RDC, le Rwanda et le Burundi, les anciennes colonies. On voit plusieurs, je sais, ça peut être des défis, des limites ou des points d'attention. Le premier, c'est la question de l'institutionnalisation, et ça revient partout, dans tous les contextes de justice transitionnelle. Une des grandes leçons apprises et qu'on retrouvera partout, c'est que la justice transitionnelle ne fonctionne pas dans une approche, comme on dit en anglais, top-down, qui va du haut vers le bas. Et pourtant, on continue à mettre en œuvre ce type d'approche, et c'est aussi ce qui est toujours un peu lié à l'institutionnalisation de la justice transitionnelle. Donc, il y aura toujours une partie d'institutionnalisation. La question, c'est comment elle se fait et comment elle intègre les personnes, les catégories de population, les sociétés qui sont les premières concernées dans ces processus de justice transitionnelle. Donc, ce que l'on sait, c'est que ce ne sont pas des mécanismes qui se décrètent unilatéralement par des États. Et quand on voit beaucoup de rapports qui sont mandatés ou de commissions parlementaires qui sont établies, on voit déjà des limites quand c'est fait de manière très unilatérale et sans concertation. Donc peut-être qu'au niveau de l'État, ça va lui servir en tant que tel, mais s'il y a des objectifs un peu plus profonds, notamment le fameux gros mot balise de réconciliation, dans ce cas-là, juste institutionnaliser telle quelle la justice transitionnelle, c'est pas forcément la meilleure des manières. Donc il y a tout un enjeu véritable de co-construction du processus dans son ensemble et dès le début avec les populations. Et en Belgique, c'est pour le moment une des grandes difficultés et on attend de voir si ça va pouvoir être remédié. L'autre défi qui est lié à la justice transitionnelle, peut-être, je ne me rends pas forcément compte je ne sais pas qui est dans le public, ce sont des mots on entend peut-être de plus en plus, mais qui restent des termes très techniques, des concepts très techniques, que les juristes se sont beaucoup appropriés, dans d'autres domaines beaucoup moins. Et donc, s'engager dans ces processus qui sont vraiment complexes et avec tout un nouveau vocabulaire, ça peut aussi avoir un effet contre-productif qui est, même s'il y a une idée très louable derrière, qui est de remédier aux injustices historiques, comme c'est le cas en Belgique, ça peut aussi avoir l'effet contre-productif de marginaliser les personnes qui sont les plus visées, puisque si les personnes ne peuvent pas interagir, ce ne sont pas leurs mots, pas leurs concepts, dans ce cas-là, ça risque aussi d'être difficile d'engager un véritable dialogue qui soit effectif. Ça, on l'a vu dans énormément de contextes en Afrique du Sud, et il y a un risque que ça se passe également dans des contextes comme en Belgique ou ailleurs. L'autre grand défi, en tout cas que l'initiative belge va poser et pose déjà, c'est l'engagement avec des États. Donc, on voit sur la base de l'expérience canadienne, et pas que, il y a aussi en Australie et dans plein d'autres pays, en Colombie, que la justice transitionnelle, pour aborder vraiment des questions d'injustice historique et structurelle dans une même société, peut fonctionner. On ne parlera jamais de succès, mais ça peut fonctionner. Maintenant, on a quand même très peu d'exemples de mécanismes qui sont interétatiques. Je n'ai pas fait de recherche approfondie. Il y a des exemples entre l'Indonésie et Timor-Leste qui sont pertinents. On pourra retrouver, la Tunisie, par exemple, fait des demandes de réparation à la France, mais qui sont pour le moment restées sans réponse, si je ne me trompe pas. Et donc, c'est quelque chose qui est à construire ou pas. Ça, c'est vraiment une question à se poser, en fait. C'est dans quelle mesure on s'engage via des mécanismes de justice transitionnelle avec des États tiers, et surtout avec qui. On a eu, je crois, une présentation de Shada Islam le premier jour qui a appelé à la fin à s'engager surtout avec les sociétés civiles et pas avec les États qui, parfois, sont des États où les gouvernements ne sont pas légitimes, voire corrompus. Je préfère le poser comme une question ici parce qu'il ne faudrait pas non plus reproduire des schémas patriarcaux en disant que ce sont des États qui sont incapables de gérer, mais c'est une vraie question. Quels sont les acteurs avec qui on va engager un dialogue, potentiellement des autorités étatiques? Et si on parle de société civile, les sociétés civiles ne sont pas homogènes, et donc avec quels acteurs on s'engage et à quelle fin? Et ça, c'est vraiment une question qui reste ouverte et qui, je pense, va nous animer chez SF dans les prochains mois pour voir un peu quelles sont les pistes de travail sur ces questions. Et surtout, si on s'engage avec les États, peut-être aussi que ça peut froisser certaines catégories de population qui sont en opposition avec leurs institutions. Donc ça, c'est vraiment des choses à prendre en compte. Et enfin, un dernier point d'attention qui est peut-être plus lié ce coup-ci à s'intéresser au spectre colonial pour aborder les injustices structurelles dans un pays, et notamment les discriminations raciales, c'est le risque aussi de laisser quand même de côté d'autres victimes de discrimination raciale qui ne sont pas directement concernées par la logique coloniale en tant que telle. Et donc, je ne pense pas que ce soit un jeu à somme nulle, ce n'est pas l'un ou l'autre, mais toute la question qui va se poser aussi, c'est comment le mécanisme qui est vraiment nécessaire pour aborder le passé colonial, et ça, je pense que personne ne peut le contester, peut aussi servir de tremplin pour aborder l'ensemble des injustices dans un pays. On a parlé juste dans la présentation précédente de la question des violences policières. Tout est lié, en fait. Donc, la conclusion est sans doute que la justice transitionnelle doit être vue comme un outil parmi d'autres, évidemment. Ce n'est pas le seul outil, c'est un outil parmi d'autres comme les plans d'action contre le racisme dont on a entendu parler. Ça permet peut-être de les opérationnaliser d'une certaine manière. C'est un outil parmi d'autres comme l'aide au développement qui est utilisé dans les relations interétatiques et qui mériterait aussi un véritable débat sur la question de la décolonisation. Mais ça doit toujours être pensé en conjonction avec d'autres politiques et donc on s'engage sur la base de l'exemple qu'on a en Belgique dans un processus qui est vraiment une boîte de Pandore assez énorme, mais qui en même temps a le mérite d'ouvrir un certain nombre de questions qui doivent être tranchées et abordées. et surtout construite par la pratique. Donc, il faut pouvoir s'alimenter des expériences des autres pays, construire les siennes. Et je pense, et je vais finir là-dessus, que c'est quelque chose de vraiment très intéressant avec les processus de justice transitionnelle dans les pays, encore une fois, dits du Nord, qui est qu'ils ont la possibilité maintenant d'apprendre des pays dits du Sud. Et que ce n'est pas juste un élément de politique extérieure. La justice transitionnelle, c'est aussi un élément de politique interne. Et que le fait de s'alimenter d'autres expériences, et notamment des pays qui ont été colonisés par ces sociétés qui maintenant vont aller dans des processus de justice transitionnelle, c'est sans doute un premier moyen aussi de redresser, enfin, peut-être pas un premier moyen, mais c'est un moyen de redresser aussi un peu l'équilibre dans les relations que moi je trouve à titre personnel intéressant d'explorer. Donc je vais m'arrêter là parce que je sais qu'on a très peu de temps pour les questions et je vous remercie pour votre attention.
Merci beaucoup, Elisa, and thank you so much to all our panelists for such rich and inspiring presentations. I think I was having a little self-congratulatory moment to Liliane and me, because I was this panel feels really it feels quite inspiring and brings a sense of hope. I think we're talking about racism and these really long and old histories. And it can feel a bit overwhelming. And for me, what came out through across all your presentations was, of course, a recognition of the enormity of the task at hand, but also a sense of all that's happening, and that there is actually quite a lot of movement right now. So I'm grateful for the perspective of both the historical continuity and the questions that are being addressed, but also the punctual sort of the punctual developments that we have to work with. And Aisha, I am so grateful for the link that you made between restitution or questions about dealing with the colonial past and the legacies in policing, and linking the NSARS and the BLM movement, right? And and you just put it so succinctly and poignantly that these are absolutely, we're talking about the same history, or we're talking about similar roots, right? And so we can talk about Black life, and we can talk about addressing the colonial past, also in a way that includes African lives on the African continent today, and African states and their relationship to to their citizens also. So thank you so much for making that link. And of course, you know, and Elisa, thank you so much for like kind of talking about what it means to adopt transitional justice now in the global North, and the opportunities that presents for learning, reversing how knowledge exchange is usually presented as, you know, from North to South, and reminding us once more of how that there is to learn, all the many directions in which knowledge exchange can go, and all that can be learned from the South in this moment. I have a couple of questions that maybe I'll throw out. So we have about, let's say, 10-15 minutes for discussion. So maybe, Liliane, what we can do is we can offer our questions. We're waiting to see, there's kind of a discussion in the chat, but we can offer our questions to the panelists, and then see how we can incorporate questions from the chat. The questions that I had, Elisa, had to do with, it was a question that was posed yesterday, and thank you also for raising this question about how we engage with the state, because I think this is at the heart of all the interventions, the role of the state, and you put it perfectly, right, that we don't want to kind of revive or extend these discourses about incapable states and that need to be bypassed, and to also recognize the complexity of civil society. And so one of the questions that was raised yesterday, I think is relevant here, was raised by Barbara Mouzouloukadi. And the question was, she wrote it in French, I'll read it. So, comment parler de réparation dans les États francophones africains lorsque les États eux-mêmes continuent des relations d'antan privilégiées avec les anciens colons? Right, so what do we, this goes back to questions of the relationship between civil society and the state, and then the former colonial powers, right? How can we talk about reparations or addressing the colonial past and redressing the relationships between former colonial powers and former colonized powers when the state itself seems to be complicit in extending those relationships? Big question, but I'm going to throw it out to you all the same. And then la question que j'avais pour vous, Pierrette, c'était par rapport au processus de réforme d'un point de vue peut-être technique ou mécanique. comment est-ce qu'on s'y prend en tant que, comment est-ce qu'on s'y prend pour pousser, pour faire avancer des réformes au sein de l'Union européenne? Donc, moi, par exemple, je ne connais pas du tout, je ne comprends pas ça et je sais que c'est extrêmement complexe, mais comment est-ce que quelqu'un dans votre position, voilà, essaie d'avancer sur ces fronts? Je pense qu'il y a de nombreuses collaborations, mais je pense que ça pourrait être utile pour nos auditrices et auditeurs d'avoir une petite idée de comment ça marche d'un point de vue mécanique. Donc voilà mes questions. Those are my questions.
Yeah, I have maybe 2 more questions. One for Aisha Ozori. When I was listening to your intervention, and also I think Siraj Rasool yesterday intervention, we can see that a lot of things are happening in the field of restitution of cultural objects. And I was wondering what kind of balance can we find in order to ensure that the state don't focus only on the restitution of objects and consider that it's sufficient to address the colonial past and say, okay, we have done all the job that we have to do with the colonial past. It can be limited to the restitution of cultural objects. So we have dealt with the whole problem. So it's a kind of a risk that I see, but I don't know if in your approach and the foundation strategy is something that you consider. And then I switched to French pour l'équité linguistique. J'ai une question donc pour Birgit Van Hout. Je me demandais en fait depuis le mouvement Black Lives Matter, est-ce que toutes les recommandations qui avaient été faites par les groupes d'experts qui visitent les pays sur la situation des afrodescendants et qui avait été, par exemple, dans le cas de la Belgique, il y avait une recommandation qui avait été faite pour mettre en place une commission. Enfin, qu'est-ce que ce mouvement est venu changer à ce travail? Est-ce que ce mouvement est venu changer quelque chose à ce travail, à ces recommandations, au type de suivi, ou est-ce que voilà, les choses continuent à s'aligner telles qu'elles avaient été préparées? Qu'est-ce que ça a changé pour le travail du groupe des experts sur les situations des afrodescendants dans les différents pays? Merci.
So, who would like to begin?
I'm happy to if you want.
Yes, please. Okay,
I really like the question. It's not heavy at all. So I obviously don't have an answer because I don't think there is one as to how do we engage reparation with states which are themselves actually still very related to their former colonial power, let's say. What I would say, I would just want to give a few orientations maybe for the answer, but it's not going to be a firm answer. I think the first one for the state who would like to repair is to maybe do its due diligence. I don't think any reparation would be meaningful if it's just negotiated between different heads of states without the involvement of those who are the most concerned. So I guess that if the conditions are not there for engaging into a meaningful process of reparation, whether it's interstate or it's directly towards the population, then probably the whole reparation cannot be called one to start with. The second, I think, is to also reflect a bit more concretely on what reparation can be. As I said in the presentation, it's not necessarily only individual reparation or financial compensation. You have a wide spectrum of potential reparations, which can be actually, and I think it's endless, the possibilities. The whole thing is about like them being inclusive and having the participation of those who will receive the reparation. And so in this case, I'm thinking about apologies. If this is something meaningful, this is already something which can be quite important in terms of recognition, but you might also think of other types of collective reparation. And I just want here to refer to the presentation that we had yesterday of Varen Shepard. I think CARICOM has developed an action plan in 10 points, which is really on these aspects. And I think it really touched upon the decolonization of also like international cooperation to development and how through development aid, you can also achieve meaningful reparation with a number of preconditions. I will not put them all there, but I think it's actually quite relevant also as a starting point, which obviously needs to be contextualized to some other places. And you can also speak about debt cancellation and so on and so forth. So I'm sorry, I don't have the perfect answer for that, but I do think that there are already a few orientations that some states can think of when they want to engage into those.
That's great. Thank you, Elisa. Yeah, it's a huge question. It's helpful to already have ways into kind of teasing the different pieces of it apart. Perhaps Aisha, would you like to go next?
Yes, sure. And just to say thank you to Liliane for the question. I agree with you. It's a risk. In fact, there are two risks. The first risk is one that I don't think anyone's mentioned, that some countries are not interested in restitution, and the sense of the people in power is that we have more pressing issues. We have real human development problems in many of our countries that we haven't sorted out. So why spend money, energy, effort chasing up on restitution, so to speak? So there's that risk, and those people exist. Then the second risk is the one that you mentioned, that there will be states who will push for restitution and they'll get these things back, and that will be it, without examining the deeper role of colonialism, the history of slavery on our collective psyche, and our record of development actually, and how we treat each other. And I'd say that's the role that we see civil society artists. And I think if you recall in my presentation, I mentioned that we're wary also of having the restitution conversations only in elite circles such as this, and how we can use artists, civil society, and other influencers in our communities to make sure that the conversation around restitution, the importance, is not limited to just the elite or the academic circles, but we find a way of having these conversations across with grassroots people who might not even appreciate art, to help them understand why this is important. I think that goes hand in hand with conversations about decolonizing our education, which is ongoing, which has been going on even since the 70s, where students are saying, don't teach us all these things that are not important, or not all this one-sided history. So I think all of it will come together. It depends on the kind of collaboration, the stakeholders that we decide to work in. For OSF, we're doing a lot of that. We're being very intentional about making sure that, as I said, it's not just even about, okay, the past injustices being redressed by getting these back. It's what to do with the future. How does this influence the future education curriculums, school curriculums, the artistic space, and all that. And so hopefully with our influence, other philanthropists who are working in this space will also take a cue. It's a real threat, but I think we have a plan to mitigate it. Just to quickly point out that, as someone mentioned in the chat, sorry, that we seem to be only focused on material culture and property. And I agree, it sounds like that when we speak, but if you look at all the documents from OSF around restitution, we're very deliberate in making sure that it's clear that we're not just talking about material, but also recordings, remains, all that. Any state, any stakeholder who are interested in getting those things back, we're happy to support them as well. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. And thank you for addressing the second question also. It's true that it's easier to speak of the material and the immaterial, so where is that access and what's happening with that is also tremendously important. So thank you for the question, Hanu, and thank you, Aisha, for addressing it. Birgit, the floor is yours.
Merci beaucoup. Et, je vais en fait suivre ce qui a été dit par les interlocuteurs précédents et commencer par la question de en quoi pourrait consister une justice transitionnelle et c'est quoi vraiment la réparation, le redresse. Et effectivement, la restitution en est un élément important. Et après, il y a aussi la compensation, hein, moi je parle maintenant de ce qui a été décrit par les experts de l'ONU de justice transitionnelle. Et il est clair que ça peut être des dommages moraux ou par exemple une perte à gagner, hein, le opportunity cost, comme on dit. Troisièmement, on parle souvent dans le contexte de justice transitionnelle comme réparation de réhabilitation, ce qui peut être des mesures de soutien de personnes souffrant de trauma ou de post-traumatic stress, que ce soit individuel, collectif, soins médicaux, psychologiques, des services sociaux éventuellement. Et troisièmement, un troisième élément de la réparation peut être la satisfaction, comme on dit. Et la satisfaction, c'est un terme qui est très large et qui peut couvrir ce qui est la recherche du disparu. Ça peut être aussi le désenterrement des remains. Ça, je ne sais pas très bien quel est le mot en français. Et un réenterrement respectueux. Ça peut être aussi les excuses dont on a parlé tout à l'heure, mais je pense qu'avec les excuses, il faut aussi être très prudent et que les excuses sont vraiment co-valables si elles sont le résultat d'un dialogue et d'une consultation large et inclusive. Parce que nous avons vu aussi, je ne dis pas seulement en Europe, mais dans plusieurs parties du monde, des excuses faites et sans préalable et sans conséquences, disons-le comme ça. Donc après, je pense aussi la question des mémorials, et on voit des très belles initiatives de mémorials qui se font aussi dans sur plusieurs continents, ainsi que bien sûr ce qui est les sanctions judiciaires ou administratives. Donc la réparation, je pense qu'il est important d'avancer plusieurs éléments ou de regarder les différents éléments en même temps et de faire le lien entre tous ces éléments. Deuxièmement, I would like to take up your question. Have we made progress, and what has Black Lives Matter changed for the UN and its architecture, in particular the working group on people of African descent? And, you know, I mean, I want to be honest with you and say that probably racism is one of the most challenging human rights questions of our time. And ever since the beginning of the creation of the United Nations, I would say that the World Conferences Against Racism have been difficult and surrounded sometimes with controversy. I remember myself from being in Durban that at the time, even the word reparation in diplomatic circles was very, very contested. When you compare to that and you see now, we've already, I think, come a long way. But clearly, the struggle against racism has been slow. And I think that the greatest obstacle that it has faced is also denial, you know, and that we still, let's look things in the face also here in Europe, that the denial of the problem and its deep-rooted and structural causes is still one of the greatest obstacles in overcoming racism and racial discrimination. But here, I would also like to throw the ball back at our listeners and say that what we have seen in several human rights movements is also the more organized the movement, the more clearly articulated the claims are, the claims for redress, the claims for human rights violations to be taken seriously and addressed, the faster we see we can see a change in the situation. And I think there has been a huge amount of movement happening since Black Lives Matter has really been sort of a catalytic moment, I find, where you see things. You mentioned the case of Belgium with the visit of the working group of experts of people of African descent, which made very substantive recommendations to the country. And you've actually seen since the Black Lives Matters how this has sort of amplified and given an additional, I would say, strength to these recommendations that had been made. And I'm thinking about things like desegregation in housing, in education. I'm thinking about access to employment and measures that are now being taken. But I'm also thinking of the initiative of the government to start a national action plan against racism. We see now across the European Union, we see a lot of interest in adopting national action plans against racism. I don't think that would have been the case without Black Lives Matter. So, whereas I would say that, of course, the UN mechanisms and the Office of the High Commissioner have for decades been working on racial discrimination and against racial discrimination. We do see that without any grassroots movement and grassroots support, or we see that thanks to that, now there is an acceleration, I would say, and the recommendations that have been made even before are now being taken more seriously. So that was my response to your question. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Birgit. Je pense qu'il est temps de clôturer la séance. Liliane, je te laisse clôturer. Je vais mettre les liens dans le chat pour les tables rondes qui vont suivre. Aujourd'hui, nous avons la table ronde du Royaume-Uni, autour du Royaume-Uni, pour le Royaume-Uni, et puis la table ronde pour la France, qui auront lieu en même temps. Donc, elle commence dans 20 minutes. Et demain, nous aurons les tables rondes d'abord pour la Belgique et ensuite pour l'Allemagne, qui, elles, ne seront pas, comment on dit, concurrentes? C'est pas le bon mot en français. Ne se dérouleront pas au même moment. Mais vous avez toutes ces informations dans votre programme. Donc, Viviane, je te laisse clôturer et puis je mets les liens dans le chat.
Je n'ai pas grand-chose à ajouter à part donc remercier énormément donc Birgit, Elisa, Aïcha, et Pierrette. Je pense qu'elle est partie, mais en tout cas, un grand merci pour vos contributions et surtout, effectivement, de nous faire prendre conscience à quel point il y a énormément de choses qui bougent. On peut, je pense que, voilà, on sent que, voilà, qu'il y a des opportunités à saisir, même si la tâche est complexe, même si le chemin à parcourir est long et laborieux, mais en tout cas, voilà, ça permet il y a des éléments prometteurs, je dirais. Donc, je vous remercie et on pourra continuer ces discussions donc, dans les différentes tables rondes qui vont avoir lieu à partir de cet après-midi et au cours des prochains jours. Et les liens sont dans le chat. Merci à vous. Très bon après-midi.
Thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you to the audience. And hopefully we'll see you soon.